In December of 1941, the world was shaken when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, drawing the United States into the conflict. This episode explores the lead-up to that pivotal moment. Winston Churchill's bold strategy to involve America, his unexpected alliance with Joseph Stalin following Adolf Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, and the careful negotiations surrounding the Atlantic Charter. We will examine the escalating tensions between the United States and Japan, including asset freezes, oil embargoes, and the efforts of the Burmese Flying Tigers, which placed Malaya and the Dutch East Indies at risk. The struggles in the Mediterranean will also be highlighted, with the war over Malta, the situation in Tobruk, and the chaotic outcomes of Operation Crusader driven by supply needs. On the Eastern Front, we will look at the crisis in Moscow, the encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk, the panic in the capital, Stalin's steadfastness, the parade in Red Square, and the Siberian-assisted counteroffensive that began in early December, all while Leningrad suffered from starvation and the first Road of Life convoys faced dangerous ice. Anticipate diplomacy, risky intelligence moves, and relentless battles that set the stage for the global conflict ahead. Winston Churchill was well known for his relentless flow of ideas about how to lead the war effort. One of his colleagues noted that the issue was his inability to discern which ideas were effective. However, Churchill was not just a clever thinker. He was also focused on one key principle from the outset. Britain could not survive against Nazi Germany alone. He understood that bringing the Americans into the conflict was crucial, as he had told his son Randolph back in May of 1940. Committed to this goal, Churchill quickly set about forming a partnership with the Bolshevik regime he had long despised. He stated in a broadcast on June 22, 1941, after the news of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, "I will unsay no word that I have spoken about it, but all this fades away before the spectacle which is now unfolding." Later, he commented to his private secretary, John Colville, "If Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." That evening, in a speech crafted with American Ambassador John G. Winant, he pledged to the Soviet Union any technical or economic assistance in our power. This speech made a strong impression in Britain, the United States, and Moscow, despite Stalin and Vyacheslav Molotov remaining skeptical about the true nature of Rudolf Hess's mission. 2 days later, Churchill directed Stuart Menzies, the head of the Secret Intelligence Service, to deliver ultra-decrypts to the Kremlin. Menzies cautioned that it would be disastrous, as the Red Army lacked effective ciphers, and the Germans would quickly identify the source of the intelligence. Churchill concurred, but later, intelligence sourced from Ultra was sent on after being suitably disguised. An agreement for military cooperation between the two nations was soon negotiated, although at this time, the British government did not believe the Red Army would withstand the Nazi assault. Churchill found encouragement in developments across the Atlantic. On July 7th, President Roosevelt informed Congress that United States forces had landed in Iceland to replace British and Canadian troops. On July 26th, the United States and Britain jointly froze Japanese assets in response to Japan's occupation of French Indochina. The Japanese sought air bases to attack the Burma Road, which was used to transport arms and supplies to the nationalist Chinese forces. Roosevelt aimed to support Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and recruited a group of mercenary American pilots, known as the Flying Tigers, to protect the Burma Road from Mandalay, their supply route. However, when the United States and Britain imposed an embargo on oil and other materials to Japan, the stakes escalated significantly. The Japanese forces were now within easy reach of Malaya, Thailand, and the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, which increasingly seemed to be their next target. Not surprisingly, Australia felt threatened as well. No one prepared as thoroughly as Churchill for his first wartime meeting with the American president in early August. Both sides effectively maintained secrecy. Churchill and his delegation, many of whom had no idea of their destination, boarded the battleship HMS Prince of Wales. The Prime Minister brought some grouse shot to entertain the President, along with some golden eggs of ultra-decrypts to impress him. He questioned Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's close friend and advisor who was accompanying them, about everything he could disclose regarding the American leader. Churchill had no memory of his first meeting with Roosevelt in 1918, where he had not made a favorable impression on the future president. Roosevelt, along with his chiefs of staff, had also put considerable effort into preparing for this encounter. In a clever move to avoid media attention, he switched from the presidential yacht Potomac to the heavy cruiser USS Augusta. On August 6th, accompanied by a strong escort of destroyers, they departed for the meeting point at Placentia Bay near Newfoundland. The relationship between the two leaders quickly blossomed, and a joint church service on the deck of the Prince of Wales, carefully orchestrated by Churchill, left a profound emotional impact. However, Roosevelt, despite being charmed and impressed by the British Prime Minister, remained somewhat distant. One biographer observed that he had a remarkable ability to treat every new acquaintance as if they were lifelong friends, creating an illusion of intimacy he used to his advantage. To foster goodwill, divisive topics were set aside, especially concerning Britain's empire, which Roosevelt disapproved of. The Atlantic Charter, signed on August 12th, pledged self-determination to a liberated world, though it implicitly excluded the British Empire and likely the Soviet Union as well. Their discussions over the following days covered a wide range of issues, from the possibility of Spain aligning with the Axis powers to the threat posed by Japan in the Pacific. For Churchill, the key outcomes included an American commitment to provide convoy escorts west of Iceland, bombers for Britain, and a promise of substantial aid to the Soviet Union to help them continue fighting. Still, Roosevelt confronted a significant reluctance among the American public to engage in war with Nazi Germany. On his return journey from Newfoundland, he learned that the House of Representatives had narrowly passed the Selective Service Bill, establishing the first peacetime draft. American isolationists were unwilling to recognize that the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union was bound to escalate the conflict far beyond Europe. On August 25th, troops from the Red Army and British forces from Iraq invaded neutral Iran to secure its oil and ensure a supply route from the Persian Gulf to the Caucasus and Kazakhstan. During the summer of 1941, Britain grew increasingly concerned about a potential Japanese attack on its territories. Acting on Roosevelt's advice, Churchill called off a planned strike by the Special Operations Executive against a Japanese freighter, the Asaka Maru, which was loading critical supplies for Japan's military. Britain could not afford to face Japan alone in the Pacific. The primary focus was on solidifying its hold in North Africa and the Mediterranean. Before the United States entered the conflict, Winston Churchill and his military advisors prioritized their nation's survival, building up a bomber force to target Germany and supporting the Soviet Union's efforts against the Germans. A bombing campaign against Germany was one of Joseph Stalin's main expectations for Allied help, especially after the German army inflicted heavy casualties on the Red Army in the summer of 1941. He also called for an invasion of northern France as soon as possible to ease the pressure on the Eastern Front. During a meeting with Sir Stafford Cripps 5 days post-invasion, Vyacheslav Molotov pressed the British ambassador to clarify the extent of the aid Churchill seemed to be promising. However, Cripps was unable to provide that information. 2 days later, after discussions in London between Lord Beaverbrook, Churchill's Minister of Supply, and the Soviet ambassador Ivan Maisky, Molotov pushed Cripps further. It appears that Beaverbrook had mentioned the potential for a French invasion to Maisky without consulting the British military leadership. From that moment, a significant aim of Soviet foreign policy became securing a firm commitment from the British. The Russians had valid reasons to believe that British hesitance stemmed from doubts that the Soviet Union could endure much longer than 5 or 6 weeks. A more considerable failure of foresight from the Soviet side soured relations until early 1944. Stalin, evaluating the Allies through his own perspective, anticipated a cross-channel operation, regardless of the associated losses and challenges. Churchill's hesitation to approve an invasion of northwestern Europe raised suspicions that Britain intended for the Red Army to bear the main burden of the war. Indeed, there was some truth to this, alongside a degree of hypocrisy from the Soviet Union. as Stalin himself had hoped that Western capitalists and the Germans would weaken one another significantly in 1940. However, the Soviet leader completely misjudged the constraints democratic governments operate under. He mistakenly believed that Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt wielded absolute power in their respective nations. The necessity for them to respond to the House of Commons or Congress, or to consider public opinion, seemed to him a feeble justification. He could never accept the notion that Winston Churchill might be compelled to resign if he initiated an operation that led to significant casualties. Even after years of intense study, Joseph Stalin had yet to grasp the foundation of Britain's long-standing strategy of peripheral warfare. Britain was not a continental power. It still depended on its naval strength and alliances to maintain a balance of power in Europe. With the notable exception of the First World War, it generally steered clear of significant land confrontations until a war was nearly over. Churchill was resolute in adhering to this approach, even though both his American and Soviet allies were committed to the opposite military philosophy of a large-scale clash as soon as possible. On July 28th, just over 2 weeks after the signing of the Anglo-Soviet agreement, Harry Hopkins arrived in Moscow on a fact-finding mission at the request of Franklin Roosevelt. Hopkins needed to determine what the Soviet Union required to sustain the war, both in the immediate future and over the long haul. The Soviet leadership welcomed him warmly. Hopkins challenged the consistently bleak accounts from the United States military attaché in Moscow, who believed the Red Army was on the brink of collapse. He quickly became convinced that the Soviet Union would endure. Roosevelt's choice to support the Soviet Union was genuinely generous as well as significant. The implementation of Soviet Lend-Lease took time, much to the president's frustration, but its scope and scale would play a crucial role in the eventual Soviet triumph, a reality that many Russian historians remain reluctant to acknowledge. Beyond high-quality steel, anti-aircraft guns, aircraft, and massive shipments of food that spared the Soviet Union from famine during the winter of 1942 to 1943, the most significant contribution was enhancing the mobility of the Red Army. Its remarkable advances later in the war were made possible solely due to American jeeps and trucks. In contrast, Churchill's promises of support were never matched by tangible results, primarily due to Britain's financial limitations and the urgency of its own pressing needs. Much of the aid offered was outdated or inappropriate. British Army greatcoats proved ineffective in the harsh Russian winter, steel-studded ammunition boots worsened frostbite, the Matilda tanks were clearly inferior to the Soviet T-34, and Red Army aviation criticized the second-hand Hurricanes, questioning why they had not received Spitfires instead. The first major conference between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union took place in Moscow at the end of September, after Lord Beaverbrook and President Roosevelt's representative Averell Harriman arrived in Arkhangelsk aboard the cruiser HMS Lincoln. Joseph Stalin welcomed them in the Kremlin and began detailing the military equipment and vehicles that the Soviet Union required. He stated, "The nation that can produce the most engines will ultimately prevail." He went on to propose to Beaverbrook that Britain should send troops to help protect Ukraine, a suggestion that clearly surprised Churchill's associate. Stalin, not willing to let go of the topic of Rudolf Hess, began probing Beaverbrook about Hitler's deputy and what he had said upon arriving in England. The Soviet leader once again surprised them by suggesting they discuss post-war agreements. Stalin sought acknowledgement of the 1941 Soviet border, which included the Baltic states, eastern Poland, and Bessarabia. Beaverbrook chose not to engage in what he felt was a rather premature discussion, especially with German forces only a short distance away from the Kremlin. Unbeknownst to them, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army had launched the first phase of Operation Typhoon against Moscow just the day before. British diplomats found themselves annoyed by Stalin's remarks that their country refused to undertake active military operations against Nazi Germany, despite British and Commonwealth troops actively fighting in North Africa. However, from the Soviet perspective, with 3 German army groups advancing deep into their territory, the battles around Tobruk and the Libyan border seemed insignificant. Shortly after the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Erwin Rommel began to devise a new attack on the besieged port of Tobruk, which had become vital to the war efforts in North Africa. He needed control of it to supply his forces and eliminate threats to his rear. Tobruk was currently under the control of the British 70th Division, bolstered by a Polish brigade and a Czech battalion. During the scorching summer months in the desert, a kind of standoff emerged, characterized by minimal conflict and only the occasional skirmish along the Libyan border. British and German reconnaissance units communicated with one another via radio, on one occasion expressing discontent when a newly assigned German officer compelled his men to open fire after a silent agreement for a ceasefire had been reached. For the foot soldiers on both sides, life became quite grim under such conditions, surviving on just 1 liter of water each day for drinking and washing. In their trenches, they faced scorpions, sand fleas, and persistent desert flies that invaded every morsel of food and every exposed bit of skin. Dysentery emerged as a significant issue, particularly for the Germans. Even the defenders of Tobruk struggled with water shortages, as a Stuka attack had destroyed the desalination plant. The town itself was heavily damaged from shellfire and bombing, with its harbor cluttered with sunken ships. Only the resolve of the Royal Navy kept the supplies coming. When a ship arrived, members of the remaining Australian brigade quickly began trading war spoils for beer. Rommel faced a much greater challenge in resupplying across the Mediterranean. From January to late August 1941, the British had succeeded in sinking 52 Axis ships and damaging 38 more. In September, the submarine HMS Upholder sank 2 large passenger ships carrying reinforcements. The failure of the Axis forces to invade Malta in 1940 had proven to be a significant error. The German Navy was particularly disheartened earlier in the year when Hitler ordered that airborne forces be deployed against Crete instead of Malta due to his concerns about Allied attacks on the Ploesti oil fields. Since then, the relentless bombing of airfields on Malta and the Grand Harbor of Valletta had not effectively compensated for the lack of an outright capture. British intelligence intercepts of Italian naval codes yielded valuable results. On November 9th, K-Force, departing from Malta with the light cruisers HMS Aurora and Penelope, along with 2 destroyers, ambushed a convoy headed for Tripoli. Although the convoy was protected by 2 heavy cruisers and 10 destroyers, the British squadron engaged under the cover of night using radar. In less than 30 minutes, the 3 Royal Navy warships sank all 7 freighters and a destroyer without taking any damage. The German Navy was furious and threatened to assume control over Italian naval operations. The Africa Corps adopted a similarly condescending attitude toward its allies, as a lieutenant in the 15th Panzer Division remarked in a letter, "You must treat the Italians like children. They may not be effective soldiers, but they make great comrades, and you can get anything from them." After numerous delays and waiting for supplies that never arrived, Rommel plotted his assault on Tobruk for November 21st. He dismissed Italian alerts about an impending British offensive, yet he felt it necessary to station the 21st Panzer Division between Tobruk and Bardia just in case. This likely would have left him with too few troops for a successful attack on Tobruk. Nevertheless, on November 18th, just 3 days before his planned strike on the port, the newly formed British Eighth Army, led by Lieutenant General Sir Alan Cunningham, crossed the Libyan border during Operation Crusader. Marching by night under strict radio silence and hiding during the day behind sandstorms and thunderstorms, the Eighth Army achieved complete surprise. The Africa Corps was composed of the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions, along with a mixed unit later dubbed the 90th Light Division. This formation included an infantry regiment largely made up of Germans who had previously served in the French Foreign Legion. However, due to malnutrition and illness, the 45,000-strong Africa Corps was down by 11,000 men in its frontline forces. The dire supply situation also meant that its panzer divisions, totaling 249 tanks, were in urgent need of replacements. The Italians had the Ariete Armored Division and 3 semi-motorized divisions. On the other hand, the British were well supplied this time, featuring 300 cruiser tanks and 300 American Stuart light tanks, known as Honeys, along with over 100 Matildas and Valentines. The Western Desert Air Force had 550 operational aircraft compared to only 76 for the Luftwaffe. With these advantages, Churchill anticipated a longed-for victory, especially since he was eager for something to present to Stalin. Yet, despite being fully equipped, British weapons were significantly inferior to those of the Germans. The new Stuarts and cruiser tanks, armed with 2-pounder guns, stood little chance against the German 88mm gun, which could destroy them before they even got into firing range. Only the British 25-pounder field gun was notable, and commanders had finally figured out how to effectively use it against German panzer assaults. The Germans referred to it as the Ratschbum. The British strategy involved concentrating XXX Corps with the majority of the armor in a northwestward attack from the Libyan frontier. The objective of these forces was to defeat the German panzer divisions and then push forward to Tobruk to lift the siege. The 7th Armored Brigade was tasked with spearheading the 7th Armored Division's attack towards Sidi Rezegh, situated on the escarpment southeast of Tobruk's defensive line. To the right, 13th Corps was set to confront the German positions near the coast at the Halfaya Pass and Salem. Ideally, the 8th Army should have waited for Field Marshal Erwin Rommel to commence his attack on Tobruk. However, Winston Churchill would not permit General Claude Auchinleck to postpone any longer. The 7th Armored Brigade successfully reached Sidi Rezegh, took control of the airfield, and captured 19 aircraft on the ground before the Germans had a chance to respond. However, the 22nd Armored Brigade on the left unexpectedly faced a fierce assault from the Ariete Division, while the 4th Armored Brigade on the right encountered elements of the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions advancing south from the coastal Via Balbia road. Fortunately for the British, the Germans were running low on diesel reserves. The fuel consumption was substantial for all vehicles in such challenging terrain. A New Zealand officer characterized the Libyan desert as a flat, barren landscape sprinkled with camel thorn, expansive stretches of desolate rock, shifting sand, and meandering shallow wadis. It increasingly resembled a military junkyard, littered with abandoned ration cans, empty oil barrels, and burnt-out vehicles. On the 21st of November, General Cunningham, with an overly optimistic outlook, decided to initiate the breakout from Tobruk, despite the fact that the German panzer force had not yet been dismantled. This decision resulted in significant losses among both the besieged forces and the 7th Armored Brigade, with one of its regiments losing 3/4 of its tanks to 88mm guns from a German reconnaissance battalion. The 7th Armored Brigade soon found itself under threat from the 2 panzer divisions and was reduced to 28 tanks by nightfall. Unaware of these losses, Cunningham proceeded to the next phase of the operation, advancing 13th Corps northward behind the Italian positions along the frontier. This effort was led by General Freyberg's New Zealand Division, backed by a tank brigade equipped with Matildas. Cunningham also instructed that the breakout from Tobruk resume. However, the 7th Armored Brigade, under pressure from 2 sides at Sidi Rezegh, had dwindled to just 10 operational tanks. The 22nd Armored Brigade, which had come to assist, was down to only 34 tanks. They were pushed back south to unite with the defensive line of the 5th South African Brigade. Rommel aimed to crush them between his panzer divisions on one side and the Ariete on the other. On November 23rd, which coincided with Totensonntag, a German day of remembrance for the deceased, a battle of encirclement began south of Sidi Rezegh against the 5th South African Brigade and the remnants of 2 British armored brigades. This resulted in a costly victory for the Germans. The South African Brigade was nearly destroyed, but it, along with the 7th Armored Support Group, inflicted significant losses on their attackers. The Germans suffered losses of 72 tanks, which were challenging to replace, as well as a remarkably high number of officers and non-commissioned officers. The 7th Indian Division and the New Zealand forces to the east also engaged effectively, with Freyberg's New Zealanders capturing part of the Afrika Korps staff. After the devastating British tank losses, Cunningham sought to withdraw, but Auchinleck overruled him, instructing him to continue the operation at any cost. This bold decision proved to be the right one as events unfolded. The following morning, Rommel, eager to complete the destruction of the 7th Armored Division and force a general retreat, became consumed by the prospect of victory. He personally led the 21st Panzer Division in a rush to the frontier, believing he could encircle most of the 8th Army. However, this led to confusion, with mixed orders and poor communication. At one point, Rommel's command vehicle broke down, leaving him out of radio contact and stranded on the Egyptian side of the dense wire fence along the frontier. His insistence on leading from the front once again caused major issues in a complicated battle. On November 26th, he learned from the headquarters of the Africa Corps that the New Zealand Division, supported by another armored brigade with Valentine tanks, had regained control of the airfield at Sidi Rezeg on their way to Tobruk. The 4th New Zealand Brigade also captured the airfield at Kambut, leaving the Luftwaffe without any forward bases. Later that day, the Tobruk garrison reunited with Freiburg's forces. Rommel's rush to the frontier turned out to be a catastrophic error. The 7th Armored Division was rearming with most of the 200 reserve tanks, while his own troops were weary. When they retreated from his ineffective attempt on November 27th, they were pursued on their return by the Hurricanes of the Western Desert Air Force, which had gained air superiority. Auchinleck chose to relieve Cunningham, whom he felt was not aggressive enough, and who was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He appointed Major General Neil Ritchie as Cunningham's replacement. Ritchie resumed the attack westward, taking advantage of Rommel's supply difficulties. The Italians again cautioned Rommel that he could expect only the bare minimum of ammunition, fuel, and rations. Despite this, the Italian Navy regained some confidence as its ships successfully delivered more supplies to Benghazi. Italian submarines were dispatched to transport critical ammunition to Darna, and the light cruiser Cardona was converted into a tanker. The Kriegsmarine was suddenly impressed by their allies' efforts. On December 2nd, Hitler transferred the 2nd Air Corps from the Eastern Front to Sicily and North Africa. Determined to support Rommel, he was alarmed to learn about the supply situation due to British attacks on Axis convoys. He instructed Admiral Raeder to send 24 U-boats to the Mediterranean. Raeder expressed concern, noting that the Führer seemed ready to practically abandon the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic to address issues in the Mediterranean. Hitler dismissed Raeder's points that most Axis transport ships were being targeted by Allied aircraft and submarines, believing that U-boats were the solution to safeguard Rommel's convoys. Ultimately, the German submarines caused significant damage to the Royal Navy. In November, U-boats in the Mediterranean sank both the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal and the battleship HMS Barham. Further losses followed, including an attack on the night of December 18th when an Italian human torpedo group led by Prince Borghese entered Alexandria harbor, sinking the battleships HMS Queen Elizabeth and Valiant along with a Norwegian tanker. Admiral Cunningham found himself without any capital ships in the Mediterranean. The timing could not have been worse, arriving just 8 days after Japanese aircraft sank both the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse off the coast of Malaya. Even with improvements for the Axis in the Mediterranean, Rommel's request on December 6th for replacement vehicles, weapons, and reinforcements was inevitably going to be turned down at such a critical time for the Eastern Front. On December 8th, Rommel ended the siege of Tobruk and started to retreat to the Gazala line, more than 60 kilometers to the west. Throughout December and into early January 1942, he pulled back from all of Cyrenaica, returning to the position he had held at the start of the previous year. The British celebrated the success of Operation Crusader, but it was a fleeting victory achieved largely due to greater numbers, not superior tactics. The biggest mistake had been the failure to keep the armored brigades unified. Over 800 tanks and 300 aircraft were lost. By the time the 8th Army reached the border of Tripolitania, a year after its triumph over the Italians, it was significantly weakened and faced long supply lines. In the fluctuating North African campaign, alongside urgent calls from the Far East, British and Dominion forces found themselves at risk of yet another defeat in 1942. Even prior to the conflict in the Far East, the British government felt overwhelmed with challenges. On December 9th, Stalin pressured Britain to declare war on Finland, Hungary, and Romania, as these nations were allies of Germany on the Eastern Front. Stalin's push for his new Western allies to agree on post-war borders, even before the battle for Moscow had commenced, was partly an attempt to address a troubling conflict. Soviet prisons and labor camps held over 200,000 Polish troops captured in 1939 during his collaboration with Nazi Germany. With Poland now an ally and its government in exile recognized by both Washington and London, General Sikorski's vigorous appeals, supported by Churchill's government, convinced an initially reluctant Soviet regime to allow the NKVD to release Polish prisoners of war to form a new army. Despite continuous obstruction from Soviet officials, the newly freed Poles began to gather and establish units under General W. Ades A. Anders, who had been imprisoned in the Lubyanka for the previous 20 months. In early December, a review of the Anders army took place near Saratov on the Volga. It was a moment filled with bitter irony, as witnessed by writer Ilya Ehrenberg. General Sikorsky arrived with Andrei Vyshinsky, the infamous prosecutor from the show trials of the Great Terror, seemingly chosen for his Polish heritage. Ehrenberg noted how Vyshinsky clinked glasses with Sikorsky, smiling sweetly. Among the Poles, there were many stern-faced individuals brimming with resentment over their experiences. Some of them openly admitted they harbored hatred towards us. While Sikorsky and Vyshinsky referred to one another as allies, the underlying hostility was palpable beneath their seemingly friendly exchanges. Stalin's animosity and mistrust of the Poles had merely changed outwardly, as future events would reveal. On July 21, 1941, the German Air Force bombed the Soviet capital for the first time. Andrei Sakharov, a fire watcher at the university, spent many nights on the roof, observing as searchlights and tracer bullets crisscrossed the tense skies over Moscow. However, after their losses in the Battle of Britain, the German bomber formations had been significantly diminished. Unable to cause serious damage to the city, they shifted their focus to support ground forces. After halting Army Group Center to concentrate on Leningrad and Kiev, Hitler finally decided to launch a major offensive against Moscow. His generals held mixed opinions. The massive encirclement east of Kiev had restored their sense of triumph, yet the vastness of the terrain, the length of their supply lines, and the surprisingly large size of the Red Army made them apprehensive. Few now believed victory was attainable that year, and they dreaded the approaching Russian winter for which they were poorly prepared. Their infantry divisions lacked boots after marching hundreds of kilometers, and efforts to provide warm clothing had been neglected entirely due to Hitler's ban on discussions regarding this issue. The armored units struggled with shortages of replacement tanks and engines, which had suffered damage from the thick dust. Yet, to their commander's frustration, Hitler hesitated to release reserves. The significant offensive against Moscow, known as Operation Typhoon, did not finalize until the end of September, delayed by General Oberst Erich Hoepner's 4th Armored Group being stuck in a stalemate near Leningrad. General Feldmarschall von Bock's Army Group Center assembled 1.5 million men, including 3 notably weakened armored groups. They faced Marshal Semyon Budenny's Reserve Front and Colonel General Andrei Yeremenko's Bryansk Front, with Colonel General Ivan Konev's Western Front forming a second line behind Budenny's forces. 12 of the divisions consisted of poorly armed and untrained militia, including students and professors from Moscow University. Most of the militia soldiers were dressed in civilian overcoats and hats. As they marched through the streets, bystanders believed they were partisans being sent against the German rear. On the 30th of September, in the early autumn mist, the initial stage of Operation Typhoon commenced as Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army advanced northeast toward the city of Orel, located more than 300 kilometers south of Moscow. The sky soon cleared, allowing the Luftwaffe to provide close support to the tank units. The sudden attack caused widespread panic in the countryside. Vasily Grossman noted in his notebook, "I thought I had witnessed retreat before, but nothing can compare to what I am seeing now." An exodus, a biblical exodus. Vehicles are moving 8 across, with the loud roar of dozens of trucks struggling to pull their wheels from the mud. Large herds of sheep and cows are driven through the fields, followed by lines of horse-drawn carts and thousands of wagons covered with colorful sacks. Crowds of pedestrians carrying sacks, bundles, and suitcases are also present. Children, with both fair and dark hair, peek out from beneath makeshift tents covering the carts, alongside the bearded faces of Jewish elders and the dark-haired heads of Jewish girls and women. There is such silence in their eyes, a wise sorrow and a sense of fate, of an overwhelming catastrophe. In the evening, the sun breaks through the layered blue, black, and gray clouds. Its rays stretch wide, reaching from the sky to the ground, reminiscent of Doré's artwork portraying those terrifying biblical events when celestial forces impact the earth. On the 3rd of October, word of the rapid advance reached Orel, but the senior officers in the city refused to take the report seriously and continued to drink. Frustrated by this dangerous complacency, Grossman and his companions began their journey toward Bryansk, anticipating the sight of German tanks at any moment. However, they were already nearing Orel. Guderian's lead units entered Orel at 6 in the evening, the forefront tanks passing trams on the street. The day before, on the 2nd of October, the main phase of Typhoon had begun further north. After a brief bombardment and the deployment of a smokescreen, the 3rd Panzer Group and 4th Panzer Group broke through on either side of the reserve front led by Marshal Boudeny. Boudeny, a cavalry buddy of Stalin's from the Civil War, was a mustachioed fool and drunkard who could not even locate his own headquarters. Konev's chief of staff was assigned to initiate a counterattack for the Western Front with 3 divisions and 2 tank brigades, but the attempt was quickly thwarted. Communication systems failed, and in just 6 days, 2 panzer groups had surrounded 5 of Boudeny's armies, converging at Vyazma. German tanks pursued Red Army soldiers, aiming to crush them under their treads like a gruesome game. The Kremlin was largely oblivious to the chaotic calamity unfolding to the west. It wasn't until October 5th that the Stavka received a report from a fighter pilot who spotted a 20-kilometer column of German armored vehicles moving toward Yuknov. No one wanted to accept it as truth. Following this, 2 more reconnaissance flights confirmed the sighting. However, Beria still menaced the commander with a potential NKVD tribunal for spreading panic. Yet, Stalin understood the threat. He convened a meeting of the State Defense Committee and signaled Zhukov in Leningrad to return to Moscow. Zhukov arrived on October 7th. He later recounted that when he entered Stalin's office, he overheard Stalin instructing Beria to use his agents to contact the Germans regarding a possible peace. Stalin tasked Zhukov with heading directly to the Western Front headquarters to assess the situation. He arrived after nightfall, finding Konev and his staff huddled over a map in candlelight. Zhukov had to call Stalin to inform him that the Germans had encircled 5 of Boudeny's armies west of Vyazma. Early on October 8th, he learned at Reserve Front headquarters that Boudeny had been missing for 2 days. The conditions within the encircled areas at Vyazma and Bryansk were horrific. Stukas, fighters, and bombers targeted any sizable groups, while the encircling panzers and artillery relentlessly bombarded the trapped forces. Rotting corpses littered the ground. Filthy and starving, Red Army soldiers resorted to slaughtering horses for food, and the wounded perished without care amid the chaos. In total, nearly 750,000 soldiers had been cut off. Those who surrendered were commanded to discard their weapons and march westward, starving. A German major noted, "The Russians are beasts. They bring to mind the brutalized expressions of the individuals in the French campaign." What a rabble. When Grossman fled from Orel on October 3rd, narrowly escaping the Germans, he was making his way to Yeremenko's headquarters in the Bryansk forest. Throughout the night of October 5th, Yeremenko awaited a response to his request for withdrawal, but no order came from Stalin. In the early morning of October 6th, Grossman and his fellow correspondents learned that even the front headquarters was in danger. They had to drive to Tula as quickly as they could to avoid the Germans cutting off their road. Yeremenko was wounded in the leg and nearly captured during the encirclement at the Bryansk front. He was evacuated by airplane, which was a stroke of luck compared to Major General Mikhail Petrov, the commander of the 50th Army, who succumbed to gangrene in a woodcutter's cabin deep in the forest. Grossman was struck by the chaos and terror behind the front lines. In Belev, along the road to Tula, he remarked, "There are a host of insane rumors circulating, totally ridiculous and filled with panic. Suddenly, there's a mad barrage of gunfire. It turns out someone turned on the streetlights, prompting soldiers and officers to fire their rifles and pistols at the lamps to put them out. If only they had directed their fire at the Germans." Not all Soviet units were performing poorly, however. On October 6th, the 1st Guards Rifle Corps, led by Major General D.D. Lelyushenko, supported by 2 airborne brigades and Colonel M.I. Katakov's 4th Tank Brigade, launched a counterattack against Guderian's 4th Panzer Division near Mtsensk in a cleverly orchestrated ambush. Katakov concealed his T-34 tanks in the woods, allowing the leading Panzer Regiment to pass. When they were delayed by Lelyushenko's infantry, his tanks emerged from the trees to strike. When deployed effectively, the T-34 was superior to the Mark IV Panzer, resulting in heavy losses for the 4th Panzer Division. Guderian was evidently unsettled to realize that the Red Army was beginning to learn from its previous mistakes in German tactics. That night, snow fell and then quickly melted. The Rasputitsa, a season of rain and mud, arrived just in time to hinder the German offensive. "I doubt anyone has witnessed such dreadful mud," Grossman observed. "There's rain, snow, hail, a liquid, bottomless swamp, black sludge mixed by countless boots, wheels, and tracks. Yet everyone is cheerful once more. The Germans are bound to get mired in our tormenting autumn." Despite the slowdown, the advance continued toward Moscow. On the Orel-Tula road, Grossman felt compelled to visit the Tolstoy estate at Yasnaya Polyana. There he encountered Tolstoy's granddaughter, who was in the process of packing up the house and museum to evacuate before the Germans arrived. He instantly recalled the scene in War and Peace where the elderly Prince Bolkonsky had to abandon his home in Lysye Gory as Napoleon's army drew near. He noted in his diary, "Tolstoy's grave, roar of fighters above, the sound of explosions, and the serene autumn calm. This is so difficult. I have rarely felt such anguish." After their departure, General Guderian arrived, intending to make this location his headquarters for the advance on Moscow. Only a handful of Soviet divisions managed to break free from the encirclement at Vyazma to the north. The smaller Bryansk pocket was becoming the most catastrophic event yet, with over 700,000 men either dead or captured. The Germans could sense victory, and a wave of euphoria swept through their ranks. The route to Moscow was barely guarded. Soon, the German press was boasting about their total triumph, yet even the ambitious General Feldmarschall von Bock felt a twinge of anxiety. On October 10th, Stalin instructed Zhukov to replace Konev and take command of the Western Front along with the remaining forces from the Reserve Front. Zhukov successfully convinced Stalin to keep Konev, who would later become his formidable rival, from being made a scapegoat. Stalin directed Zhukov to hold the line at Mozhaisk, located only 100 kilometers from Moscow along the Smolensk highway. Realizing the extent of the crisis, the Kremlin ordered the creation of a new defensive line, enlisting 250,000 civilians, mostly women, to dig trenches and anti-tank ditches. Many of them lost their lives to German aircraft attacks as they worked. Discipline tightened even further, with NKVD blocking units prepared to execute anyone who retreated without orders. An NKVD officer remarked, "They used fear to conquer fear." The NKVD special detachments, which would become known as Smersh in 1943, were already interrogating officers and soldiers who had escaped encirclements. Those labeled as cowards or suspected of colluding with the enemy were executed or sent to punishment companies, known as Strafroti. There they faced the most perilous tasks, such as leading assaults through minefields. Criminals from the Gulag were also conscripted as Strafniks, and they retained their criminal nature. Even the execution of a gang leader by an NKVD officer firing a shot to his temple had only a momentary impact on his followers. Other squads from the NKVD visited field hospitals to look into potential cases of self-inflicted wounds. They promptly executed individuals known as self-shooters or left-handers, those who shot themselves in the left hand in a misguided effort to avoid fighting. A Polish surgeon with the Red Army later confessed to amputating the hands of boys who resorted to such measures, aiming to save them from execution. Prisoners held by the NKVD faced even harsher fates. Beria had 157 notable captives put to death, including Trotsky's sister. Others suffered from guards tossing hand grenades into their cells. Only by the end of the month did the pressure ease when Stalin dismissed Beria's conspiracy theories as nonsense. The deportation of 375,000 Volga Germans to Siberia and Kazakhstan, which began in September, sped up to include all individuals of German descent in Moscow. Preparations to sabotage the metro and vital buildings in the capital were set in motion. Even Stalin's dacha was rigged with explosives. NKVD assassination and sabotage teams relocated to secure locations within the city, prepared for guerrilla actions against a German occupation. The diplomatic corps received orders to move to Kuibyshev on the Volga, a city designated as a backup capital for the government. Major theater companies in Moscow, emblematic of Soviet culture, were also instructed to leave the capital. Stalin himself struggled to decide whether to remain in the Kremlin or flee. On October 14th, while part of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army in the south bypassed the heavily fortified city of Tula, the 1st Panzer Division took control of Kalinin, north of Moscow. They captured the bridge over the upper Volga, cutting off the Moscow-Leningrad railway line. In the center, the SS Das Reich Division and the 10th Panzer Division arrived at the historic battlefield of Borodino, just 110 kilometers from the capital. Here, they encountered fierce resistance from forces bolstered by the new Katyusha rocket launchers and 2 Siberian rifle regiments, early elements of many divisions that would catch the Germans off guard around Moscow. Richard Sorge, the crucial Soviet agent in Tokyo, uncovered plans for the Japanese to strike south into the Pacific against the Americans. Although Stalin held some skepticism towards Sorge, despite his accurate predictions about Barbarossa, the information was validated by intercepted signals. The diminished threat to the eastern part of the Soviet Union enabled Stalin to start moving even more divisions west along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Zhukov's victory at Khalkhin Gol significantly contributed to this critical strategic shift by the Japanese. The Germans had misjudged the impact of the rain and snow on their offensive, turning paths into thick, black mud that slowed their progress. The supply of fuel, ammunition, and food was hindered, further dragging down their advance. Additionally, the soldiers trapped in encirclement fought back, preventing the invaders from freeing up troops to continue pushing toward Moscow. General der Flieger Wolfram von Richthofen flew at a low altitude over what remained of the Vyazma pocket, observing the heaps of corpses and the wrecked vehicles and artillery. The Red Army also benefited from disruptions caused by Hitler. The 1st Panzer Division at Kalinin, ready to move south toward Moscow, was unexpectedly ordered to change course alongside the 9th Army to try and create another encirclement with Army Group North. Hitler and the High Command were oblivious to the conditions their troops faced, but the sense of victory within Führer headquarters was starting to fade, leading to a decrease in focus on the attack on Moscow. On October 15th, Stalin and the State Defense Committee decided to evacuate the government to Kuibyshev. Officials were instructed to leave their offices in board trucks waiting outside to take them to the Kazan railway station. Others had similar thoughts. Factory managers evacuated their families from the capital, sparking chaos. Civilians began looting stores. Walking down the streets, one could see joyful, drunken faces carrying sausages and rolls of fabric. Events unfolded that once would have seemed unimaginable. Rumors spread that Stalin and the government had abandoned Moscow. The panic and looting intensified, with wild stories claiming the Germans were already at the city gates. Terrified officials destroyed their Communist Party membership cards, an act many would later regret when the NKVD re-established control, leading to accusations of criminal defeatism. On the morning of October 16th, Alexei Kosygin arrived at the building of the Council of People's Commissars, where he served as deputy chairman. He discovered the premises unlocked and deserted, with classified documents scattered across the floor. Telephones rang in vacant offices. Assuming they were calls from people curious about the government's departure, He answered one. An official inquired if Moscow would be surrendered. Meanwhile, the police had disappeared from the streets. Like in Western Europe the previous year, Moscow was gripped by a panic over enemy paratroopers. Natalia Gessi, on crutches after surgery, found herself amidst a crowd that suspected she had broken her legs parachuting in. Many of the looters were intoxicated, rationalizing their thefts by claiming they needed to take what they could before the Germans arrived. Frantic crowds at train stations, attempting to board departing trains, were dubbed human whirlpools, where children were wrenched from their mothers' embraces. Ilya Ehrenberg noted that what unfolded at Kazan station was beyond description. Conditions were little better at Moscow's western train stations, where countless wounded soldiers lay neglected on stretchers along the platforms. Women desperately searching for sons, husbands, or boyfriends moved among them. Shocked by the sights around him, Stalin emerged from the Kremlin. A state of siege was declared, and NKVD rifle regiments were deployed to clear the streets, shooting looters and deserters on sight. Order was harshly restored. Stalin then made the decision to remain, which was communicated on the radio. This was a pivotal moment that significantly shifted the mood from mass panic to a collective determination to defend the city at all costs. It mirrored the change in spirit during the defense of Madrid 5 years earlier. Emphasizing secrecy, Stalin informed the State Defense Committee that the celebrations for the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution would still proceed. Several committee members were taken aback, but they understood it was worth the risk to demonstrate to the nation and the world that Moscow would never surrender. On the eve of the revolution, Stalin delivered a speech broadcast from the Grand Hall of the Mayakovsky metro station. He called upon the great, yet hardly working-class heroes of Russian history, Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, Suvorov, and Kutuzov. He declared, "The German invaders seek a war of extermination. Very well, they shall have one." This marked Stalin's notable return to Soviet awareness, after months of distancing himself from the setbacks of retreat. Years later, Ilya Ehrenberg reflected, "I reviewed old newspapers from July to November 1941, and Stalin's name barely appeared." Now, the leader was closely associated with the brave defense of the capital. The following day, November 7th, Stalin took the salute from Lenin's empty mausoleum in Red Square, as waves of reinforcements marched through the falling snow, preparing to head northwest to the front lines. The shrewd Stalin anticipated the impact of this dramatic display, ensuring it was captured for both foreign and domestic newsreels. As the week progressed, the hard frosts arrived, and by November 15th, the German advance resumed. It quickly became apparent to Georgy Zhukov that their primary attack would be directed at the Volokholamsk sector, where Konstantin Rokossovsky's 16th Army was compelled to carry out a fighting retreat. Zhukov faced intense pressure and lost his temper with Rokossovsky. The difference between them was striking, despite both being former cavalrymen. Zhukov was a stocky whirlwind of energy and ruthlessness, while the tall and poised Rokossovsky remained calm and practical. Coming from a family of minor Polish nobility, Rokossovsky had been detained near the end of the Red Army purge. He had 9 steel teeth, replacing those lost during the grueling interrogations. Stalin had ordered his release, but occasionally reminded him that this was a temporary reprieve. Any misstep would see him handed back to the enforcers. On November 17th, Stalin issued an order for all forces and partisans to destroy and burn to ashes all buildings in the combat zone and beyond, denying the Germans any shelter in the approaching cold. The fate of civilians went unacknowledged. The plight of soldiers, particularly the wounded left on railway platforms, was equally dreadful. A Red Army officer wrote, "Stations were covered with human waste and wounded soldiers with blood-stained bandages." By the end of November, the German 3rd Panzer Army was merely 40 kilometers from Moscow on the northwest side, with one of its leading units even capturing a bridgehead across the Moscow-Volga Canal. The 4th Panzer Army had reached a point just 16 kilometers from the western edge of Moscow, having pushed back Rokossovsky's 16th Army. It is reported that in thick fog, a motorcyclist from the SS Deutschland regiment rode straight into Moscow and was shot by an NKVD patrol near the Belarusian station. Other German units could see the onion domes of the Kremlin through powerful binoculars. The Germans were fighting fiercely, knowing that the harsh Russian winter was approaching. However, their troops were weary, and many were already suffering from frostbite. Construction of defensive positions leading to Moscow continued at a frantic pace. Steel hedgehogs, made from welded steel girders like giant caltrops, served as barriers against tanks. The NKVD created destroyer battalions to counter paratroop or sabotage attacks on vital factories, forming a last line of defense. Each soldier received a rifle, 10 rounds of ammunition, and some grenades. Joseph Stalin, fearing that Moscow might be surrounded from the north, ordered Georgy Zhukov to prepare a series of counterattacks. But first, he needed to reinforce the armies northwest of Moscow, which had been battered by the 3rd and 4th Panzer armies. The situation also looked critical in the south. The army group under Gerd von Rundstedt had secured the Donbass mining and industrial region in mid-October, right at the time the Romanians finally captured Odessa. Erich von Manstein's 11th Army was laying siege to the significant naval base of Sebastopol in Crimea. The 1st Panzer Army was advancing quickly toward the Caucasus, leaving the infantry behind. On November 21st, the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, led by Brigadeführer Sepp Dietrich, whom Richthofen referred to as the good old war horse, entered Rostov at the edge of the Caucasus and established a bridgehead across the River Don. Hitler was elated, believing the oil fields further south were within reach. However, Kleist's Panzer spearhead was overstretched, with its left flank protected only by lightly armed Hungarian troops. Marshal Timoshenko seized the opportunity and launched a counterattack across the frozen Don. Realizing that a full advance into the Caucasus was unfeasible before the next spring, Rundstedt pulled his forces back to the line of the river Meuse, which flows into the Sea of Azov west of Taganrog. Hitler responded to this initial withdrawal of the German army in the war with furious disbelief. He ordered an immediate cancellation of the retreat. Rundstedt offered his resignation, which was quickly accepted. On December 3rd, Hitler traveled to Army Group South's headquarters in Poltava, a site where Charles XII of Sweden had faced a decisive defeat. The following day, Hitler appointed General Feldmarschall von Reichenau, a committed Nazi whom Rundstedt derogatorily referred to as a roughneck who exercised half-naked. However, Hitler was surprised to learn that Sepp Dietrich, the commander of the SS Leibstandarte, endorsed Rundstedt's decision. Reichenau, after reassuring Hitler that he would not retreat, proceeded with the withdrawal, effectively presenting Führer headquarters with a done deal. With limited options, Hitler then compensated the dismissed Rundstedt with a birthday gift of 275,000 Reichsmark. He often cynically remarked on how easily he could entice his generals with money, land grants, and medals. Leningrad had managed to avoid destruction, partly due to Zhukov's harsh leadership and the troops' resolve, but mainly because the Germans chose to focus on Moscow instead. From that point onward, Army Group North became the neglected segment of the Eastern Front, rarely receiving reinforcements and constantly worried about losing units to reinforce the Central and Southern fronts. This lack of attention from the Germans was overshadowed by the Soviets' neglect, as Stalin on multiple occasions contemplated reducing troop presence in Leningrad to defend Moscow. Stalin had no fondness for what he perceived as a city of intellectuals who looked down upon Muscovites and had an affinity for Western Europe. It is unclear how seriously he contemplated abandoning the city, but it is evident that during that autumn and winter, he prioritized the preservation of the Leningrad Front's forces over the city itself, or its residents. Soviet efforts to break the encirclement with the 54th Army failed to dislodge the Germans from the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. Nevertheless, the defenders maintained control over the isthmus connecting the city and the lake, partly because the Finns hesitated to advance into territories held by the Soviet Union prior to 1939. The siege fell into a routine, with the Germans conducting regular bombardments of the city at set intervals. Civilian casualties increased, primarily due to starvation. Leningrad had effectively become an island. The only way to reach the mainland was through Lake Ladoga or by air. Approximately 2.8 million civilians were trapped, and with 500,000 soldiers, the authorities had to provide for 3.3 million people. Food distribution was horrifically unequal in a society that claimed to be egalitarian. Party officials ensured their families and close associates did not suffer, while those in charge of food supply, from the shops down to the canteens, exploited the situation for their own gain. Bribery was often necessary just to secure basic rations. Food became a source of power for both corrupt individuals and the Soviet state, which had long employed it to enforce obedience or to retaliate against disfavored groups. Industrial workers, children, and soldiers received full rations, while others like non-working wives and teenage children received only a dependent ration. Their ration card became infamously known as the death card. Those considered useless mouths faced this grim reality, while party leaders enjoyed additional rations to aid their governance, justified as being for the common good. Vasily Churkin expressed the dire situation in late October while defending the line near Schlisselburg on Lake Ladoga. He stated, "We receive 300 grams of bread that resembles black earth and watery soup. We are feeding our horses birch twigs without leaves, and they are dying one after another. Locals from Beryozovka and our soldiers leave only the bones of fallen horses, chopping off pieces of meat to boil." Soldiers had it better than civilians, and those with families in the city were growing increasingly anxious as winter approached. Horrifying tales of cannibalism started to spread. Churkin recounted that our Corporal Andronov, a tall, robust man full of energy, made a fatal error. The chief of supplies sent him in a vehicle to Leningrad on some pretext. At that time in Leningrad, they were suffering more than we were, and many of us had families there. The vehicle with Andronov was stopped en route. Inside, they discovered canned food, meat, and cereals taken from our own scant rations intended for our families. The tribunal sentenced both Andronov and his chief to death. His wife and small child were in Leningrad. It is said that their neighbor resorted to cannibalism and that the wife lost her sanity. The starving city desperately required hard frosts to ensure the ice on Lake Ladoga could bear the weight of trucks delivering food supplies along the ice road. Significant risks were taken during the initial week of December. Churkin noted, "I saw a Polutorka truck. Its back wheels had broken through the ice, and inside were sacks of flour, still dry. The cabin tilted upwards, with its front wheels resting on the ice. I passed about a dozen Polutorka trucks loaded with flour that had frozen into the ice. They were pioneers of the road of life. No one was around the trucks." The people of Leningrad would have to wait a bit longer for the supplies that had already been gathered. At the lakeside settlement of Kabona, Churkin observed an enormous number of sacks filled with flour and boxes of foodstuffs lined along the bank, extending for miles, preparing to be transported across the ice to starving Leningrad. By early December, many German commanding officers in Army Group Center recognized that their weary and frozen troops could no longer advance on Moscow. They sought to pull back their diminished forces to a defensible position until spring, but such arguments had already been dismissed by General Halder per the directives from Führer headquarters. Some began to reflect on the events of 1812 and the disastrous retreat of Napoleon's army. Despite the ground now being frozen, the supply situation continued to worsen. With temperatures plummeting below -20 degrees Celsius and frequent zero visibility, the Luftwaffe remained grounded most of the time. Like airfield crews, motorized troops had to start fires under their vehicle engines to get them running. Machine guns and rifles froze completely because the Wehrmacht lacked the appropriate oil for winter conditions, and radios failed to function in the severe cold. The draught horses brought in from Western Europe were unaccustomed to the frigid temperatures and lacked sufficient forage. Bread arrived in a solid block. Soldiers had to saw it apart and warm it in their trouser pockets before they could eat. The weakened soldiers found it impossible to dig trenches in the frozen ground without first melting it with large bonfires. Few replacements had come for their jackboots, which had fallen apart after extensive marching. There was also a lack of proper gloves. The number of frostbite cases now surpassed the number of soldiers wounded in combat. Officers expressed that their soldiers had begun to resemble Russian peasants since they had taken the winter clothing from civilians, often coercing them at gunpoint to surrender their boots. Women, children, and the elderly were expelled into the snow from their log cabins, while soldiers tore up the floors in search of hidden reserves of potatoes. It may have been less brutal to simply kill their victims than to force them to endure starvation or freeze to death, half-clothed in what was proving to be one of the harshest winters in years. Conditions for Soviet prisoners were particularly dire. Thousands succumbed to exhaustion during forced marches westward through the snow, as well as starvation and disease, particularly typhus. Some resorted to cannibalism in their dehumanized state of extreme suffering. Each morning their guards made them run several hundred meters, beating them mercilessly. Those who collapsed were shot on the spot. Cruelty had become an addiction for those who possessed total control over individuals they had been taught to scorn and resent. By December 1st, German heavy artillery was finally within range of Moscow. On that day, General Field Marshal von Kluge's Fourth Army initiated the final assault on the city from the west. The biting wind created deep snowdrifts, exhausting the soldiers as they struggled through them. Yet with a surprise artillery attack and some air support from the German Air Force, Kluge's 20th Corps managed to breach the Soviet 33rd Army toward the Minsk-Moscow highway, putting the rear of the neighboring Soviet Fifth Army at risk. Zhukov responded promptly, deploying all reinforcements he could muster, including the Siberian 32nd Rifle Division. By late December 4th, the Red Army's position had been restored. The German infantry was collapsing from fatigue and the relentless cold. The temperature had plummeted below -30 degrees Celsius. "I cannot describe to you what this means," a soldier in the 23rd Infantry Division wrote home on that day. "First, the unbearable cold, blizzards, and our soaked-through feet. Our boots never dry out, and we aren't permitted to take them off. And secondly, the pressure from the Russians." Kluge and Bach understood that they had failed. They attempted to reassure themselves with the thought that the Red Army must also be on the brink of exhaustion, just as Hitler had frequently claimed. They could not have been more mistaken. Over the past 6 days, Zhukov and the Stavka had been preparing for a counteroffensive. With leaders like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Lelyushenko, and Konev, a new level of professionalism began to take shape. This was no longer the sluggish organization seen in June, where commanders, fearful of arrest by the secret police, hesitated to take any initiative. The cumbersome formations of that era had been discarded. The Soviet army now consisted of just 4 divisions. For the time being, the corps level of command was removed to enhance control. 11 new armies were established behind the front lines. Some included ski battalions and well-trained Siberian divisions, equipped for winter combat with padded jackets and white camouflage. The new T-34 tank, with its broad tracks, performed better on ice and snow than the German tanks. Additionally, unlike German equipment, Soviet weapons and vehicles were lubricated to withstand cold temperatures. Red Army aviation regiments gathered at airfields around Moscow. With their Yak fighters and Sturmovik ground attack aircraft, they aimed to secure air supremacy for the first time, while most of the German Luftwaffe remained grounded by the frost. Zhukov's strategy, endorsed by Stalin, sought to dismantle the 2 German bulges flanking Moscow. The main bulge to the northwest included the German Fourth Army and the diminished 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies. The southern bulge, just east of Tula, was occupied by Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army. However, Guderian, sensing the impending threat, began to withdraw some of his forward units. At 3 o'clock in the morning on Friday, December 5th, Konev's newly formed Kalinin Front launched an attack on the north side of the primary bulge, with the 29th and 31st Armies crossing the frozen Volga. The following morning, the 1st Shock Army and the 30th Army moved westward. Zhukov then dispatched 3 more armies, including Rokossovsky's reinforced 16th Army and Vlasov's 20th Army, to strike the southern side. His objective was to encircle the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies. Once a gap appeared, Major General Lev Devader's 2nd Guards Cavalry Corps surged in, creating chaos in the German rear. The resilient Cossack ponies maneuvered easily through the deep snow and quickly caught up with the German infantry struggling to retreat. To the south, the 50th Army attacked the northern flank of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army from Tula, while the 10th Army advanced from the northeast. Pavel Belov's 1st Guards Cavalry Corps, backed by tanks, launched an offensive into the rear of the German forces. Guderian acted swiftly and managed to pull most of his troops back. However, he could not re-establish the line as he had intended due to the 13th Army and an operational group from the southwestern front advancing against his southern flank. This forced Guderian to retreat another 80 kilometers, creating a significant gap between him and the 4th Army on his left. The Red Army still lacked sufficient tanks and artillery, but with their new units, they were close to matching German manpower on the Moscow front. Their primary advantage lay in the element of surprise. The Germans had dismissed reports from Luftwaffe pilots regarding large military formations behind their lines, and they were out of reserves. Heavy fighting southeast of Leningrad and the withdrawal of Army Group South to the Meuse meant that Bach could not secure reinforcements from the flanks. Even a supply Obergefreiter in the 31st Infantry Division sensed the unease, writing home that he felt something was wrong, saying, "One simply has a bad feeling that this vast Russia is just too much for our strength." By December 7th, the battle for the crucial salient was progressing favorably, and it seemed likely that the Soviet goal of encircling the 3rd Panzer Army and part of the 4th might be achievable. However, the advance was sluggish, much to Zhukov's frustration, as the forces were bogged down attempting to eliminate every German strongpoint defended by improvised combat groups. 2 days later, Zhukov instructed his commanders to halt frontal assaults and instead circumvent centers of resistance to penetrate deeper into the German rear. On December 8th, a German soldier noted in his diary, "Are we going to have to pull out? Then God have pity on us." They understood the implications of this in the open snowfields. The retreat along the front became marked by burning villages set ablaze as they struggled to withdraw through deep snow. The route was strewn with abandoned vehicles running out of fuel, exhausted horses, and even wounded soldiers left behind in the snow. Starving troops resorted to slicing frozen flesh from the sides of the horses, while Siberian ski battalions emerged from the icy mists to harass and attack. With grim satisfaction, they observed the utterly insufficient equipment of the Germans, who were reduced to wrapping themselves in mittens and shawls taken from villagers or straight off the backs of the elderly. "The frosts were exceptionally severe," wrote Ehrenberg, but the Red Army Siberians complained, if only a real frost came, that would finish them off right away. Their vengeance was fierce following the reports of German treatment of their prisoners and civilians. Virtually unhindered by the German Air Force, Red Army fighter planes and Sturmovik regiments relentlessly attacked the long columns of retreating troops, silhouetted against the snow. Raiding groups from Belov's and Dovator's Guards Cavalry Corps made deep incursions into the rear, striking at depots and artillery batteries with drawn sabers. Partisans targeted supply lines, sometimes joining forces with the cavalry. Zhukov made the decision to drop the 4th Airborne Corps by parachute behind the German front lines. Soviet troops felt no sympathy for the frost-bitten and lice-infested German infantry. German field hospitals faced an increasing number of amputations as untreated frostbite led to gangrene. With temperatures plunging below -30, blood froze instantly in wounds, and many soldiers suffered intestinal issues from sleeping on the frozen ground. Almost all experienced diarrhea, an even more debilitating affliction in such conditions. Those who could not move on their own were doomed. Many of the wounded shoot themselves, a soldier recorded in his diary. Frozen weapons often malfunctioned. Tanks were abandoned due to a lack of fuel. A fear of being cut off began to spread. More officers and soldiers started to regret their treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. Yet, despite constant thoughts of the year 1812 and a sense that the German army was now cursed like Napoleon's Grand Army, the retreat did not quite turn into utter chaos. The German army, particularly on the brink of disaster, often surprised its adversaries with how fiercely it fought back. Improvised Kampfgruppen, assembled under duress by military police, rounding up stragglers during the retreat, and led by determined officers and non-commissioned officers, managed to hold their ground, combining infantry, engineers, and various weapons such as flak guns and the occasional self-propelled gun. On December 16th, one group that had broken through an encirclement finally reached the German lines. "There's an enormous number of men suffering from nervous collapse," one of them recorded in his diary. "Our officer is in tears." Hitler initially reacted with disbelief to the news of the Soviet offensive, convinced that reports of new armies were just a deception. He struggled to comprehend their sudden emergence. Humiliated by this unexpected shift in the tide of war, after so many claims of victory over the Slavic subhumans, he felt both anger and confusion. Relying on his fundamental belief that willpower would prevail, he overlooked the fact that his soldiers were poorly equipped, lacking clothing, ammunition, food, and fuel for their armored vehicles. Fixated on Napoleon's retreat in 1812, he was determined to avoid a repeat of that history. He commanded his troops to hold their ground, despite their inability to dig defensive positions in the hardpan earth. While all attention in Moscow was focused on the significant conflict to the west, news of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor did not have much of an effect. However, the situation was quite different in the city of Kuibyshev, where foreign correspondents were still compelled by Soviet censors to date their articles from Moscow. Ilya Ehrenberg noted with amusement how the Americans in the Grand Hotel clashed with Japanese journalists. For those Americans and Japanese, it would truly be just the beginning of their troubles.